Welcome back, everyone, to the final part of our look at the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, with the second half of our look at Alternate History Hub's video on the election that ruined everything and if it never happened, which is the 1912 election. So I want to take a few minutes and give a little more context and background to what actually happened before we get into the final part of this what-if scenario. So we've been talking a lot about some of the reasons why people consider Woodrow Wilson to be one of the worst presidents, and a number of people talk about the introduction of the income tax, which happens during Woodrow Wilson's first term. So a little context to this. Prior to this time, with the exception of times of war when temporary income taxes were introduced, by and large, the federal government's revenue came in the form of tariffs. So, taxing imports and things like that. That had always been the case. There had been times here and there that other things had been done and tried, but that was the majority of the income for the federal government. So at the beginning of the 1900s, there's a lot of talk about other ways, about doing tariff reform, reducing the tariff, which was pretty high at that point. I think when they finally introduced the income tax, it was like in the 40% range. So they were talking about reform, and they were talking about different ways to do that, ideas of estate taxes, corporate taxes, different things. And so the idea comes up of a permanent income tax. Now, it's important to point out that Woodrow Wilson was not the only person who supported the idea of an income tax. Theodore Roosevelt was a proponent of an income tax, as was eventually William Howard Taft. So no matter who won the 1912 election, there was going to be an income tax. In fact, the constitutional amendment, which made it possible for the federal government to create a permanent income tax, went through during Taft's administration with his support. Now, there's always nuance to this stuff. It's never black and white. And in Taft's case, he was brought along kind of kicking and screaming a little bit to the idea of a income tax. And he supported the constitutional amendment for one reason, being that it would mean that they wouldn't immediately adopt any kind of a tax, and it would not necessarily get passed. And so maybe the country would speak and reject the amendment, and then he wouldn't have to support it. So it's a lot more complicated, and I'm oversimplifying it there. But the bottom line is that no matter who got elected president in 1912, there was going to be an income tax. It's just that when Woodrow Wilson becomes president, the first federal laws that were authorized by the constitutional amendment are passed with Wilson's support. When there's a constitutional amendment, the amendment just makes it possible for the federal government to pass laws. So, for example, the constitutional amendment that we know as Prohibition, what really gave teeth to that amendment was something called the Volstead Act, which was the federal law that was passed in response to the amendment that made the enforcement of that amendment possible. So same thing here. The federal income tax required laws to be passed, which were passed under Wilson's administration. So anyway, that is all to say that we can't lay the blame for an income tax solely at Woodrow Wilson's feet, because it was going to happen regardless of who was president. Secondly, another thing that I want to talk a little bit about is I want to look at the 1912 and 1916 elections real quick before we get into this, because a couple of things are at play here. Number one is 1912 is the first election where you have people actually voting in some states for a nominee. Prior to this, the party nominees were chosen by delegates who basically went to the convention kind of like free agents. They could choose whoever they wanted. They weren't bound to a candidate because of how their state had voted, as we know it today. That began to change in 1912. Now, it wasn't all states, but a lot of states did start allowing for a popular vote choice for the nominee. And most of the delegates that William Howard Taft receives, the delegates that he needs in order to eventually get the Republican nomination, come in the form of popular votes from southern states that were going to go for the Democratic candidate no matter what. And so Theodore Roosevelt rightly argues that it was ridiculous to support a nominee whose support came primarily from states the Republicans were never going to win. And so he basically made it known that if he was not the Republican nominee, he was going to start a third party. So he made it a threat to try and sway the votes in his favor. And 9 of the last 10 votes then in states all go for Theodore Roosevelt after he made that clear. But it was too little too late, and Taft goes in with just enough of the votes to be able to get the nomination. Again, I'm oversimplifying. There was a lot more to it than that. That's basically what's going on there. The last thing I want to look at then is the 1916. Well, let's look at 1912 real quick. So you can see it's an electoral landslide for Woodrow Wilson. But again, that's because Roosevelt and Taft divide the vote. You can see there that between the two of them, they get almost 8 million votes to Woodrow Wilson's 6.3 million. Now, some of those progressive votes probably could have gone to Woodrow Wilson, so we shouldn't just assume it would have been a Republican landslide. And the socialist candidate, Eugene Debs, also kind of comes into play here too. But here are the delegates going into the convention. Let's take a look at this real quick. Let's go back up. So you have William Howard Taft, 561. Roosevelt, just 107. But there was actually a lot more, like I said, a lot more to it than that. You can see here that in the nomination race, Roosevelt gets 466 delegates. He gets 1.18 million of the votes to Taft's 791,000. So he actually got more votes than Taft. He just didn't get enough delegates. And then once the vote goes down, you can see how it all goes. And a lot of people voted present but didn't vote for a candidate. Anyway, 1916 is really interesting because it's one of the closest elections in history, and a couple thousand votes decided this election. First of all, kind of a cool thing here, you have Charles Evans Hughes as the Republican nominee. He was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. Now, he resigned his Supreme Court seat when he was given the Republican nomination, and then eventually comes back to the Supreme Court and succeeds William Howard Taft as the Chief Justice of the United States. So he served as an associate justice, took like 14 years off, and then came back as the Chief Justice. His vice presidential candidate was former Vice President Charles Fairbanks, who had been, I think, he had been Theodore Roosevelt's vice president. So Hughes wins in a landslide, the Republican nomination. But let's look at the votes. And I'm going to sort these votes by margin. Actually, I already have them sorted that way. And you can see here, for example, Woodrow Wilson gets 98% or 97% of the vote in South Carolina. He gets 93% of the vote in Mississippi, 86% of the vote in Louisiana. And so you can see the Democratic stronghold of the South. And so he gets a lot of those votes. The Progressive Party with no candidate gets as high as 13% in Georgia. But you can see Charles Evans Hughes is getting next to nothing in a lot of these states. But here are the states that swung this. And you can look specifically at California. 266 was needed to win, and you needed 11 votes or 12 votes, electoral votes to switch to give Fairbanks the election, and you have 13 in California. And California was decided by a margin of 3,700 votes. So if you have 1,900 people switch their vote from Wilson to Hughes. Hughes wins the presidency. 1,900 votes decided that election. We've had closer elections, but not many. You can see that New Hampshire, which was only 4 electoral votes, came down to 56 votes. So 28 people changed their vote there, and you swing that state. And 900 people changed their votes in North Dakota, and you swing that state. So this was a very, very close election. All right. Let's go ahead and dive into the last part of this video, starting with Germany's fate.
If Germany was defeated easily militarily and they didn't have to face revolutions or the lack of supplies, there still isn't a way to predict how they would end up. The fate of their future is entirely in the treaty and how they would lose the war, which...
And the lack of supplies is something important to point out. I said yesterday that I didn't necessarily agree with the notion that American troops on the Western Front earlier would turn the tide. What really turns the tide in this war is the continued blockade of German ports and the inability to get food and supplies, both on the home front and for the military. That issue is not as much of a problem in 1915 and 1916. Germany launches their spring offensives in 1918, which basically weakens them to the point of collapse because they know they're on their last legs back home with the supplies. They know they're running out of manpower to be able to throw at the Allies, and they know the Americans are coming in. Those issues all change in 1915, 1916.
I can't predict for certain, but there are a few possibilities for how it turns out. So we'll just rush through this. Germany is defeated so badly, they end up losing land and become far smaller than even their post-war borders. The Kaiser resigns, and Germany becomes a democratic nation. Germany is defeated just as badly as the first option, but the Kaiser remains in power with his influence greatly diminished, becoming something of a parliamentary monarchy like Britain. Germany loses the borders that it did in our timeline. However, the treaty is not as severe.
A lot of choices here.
Or the most extreme option, Germany is completely militarily defeated. The Allies push in and occupy the country just like in World War II. Basically, Germany as a nation doesn't exist for at least a few decades, or until they decide it can be on its own again.
So I doubt the last one happens, only because the reason it happened after World War II is because we had been through this twice. We weren't going to let Germany do it again. So there were lessons that were learned from 2 world wars that they were building off of. So I don't think they would have gone the route of occupation, dismantling Germany completely and putting them into occupation zones like what we had, where you have the Soviets with Eastern Germany and then the French, the Americans, and the British controlling West Germany, which is why you end up with 2 separate countries for 40 plus years.
This would lead to a lot of colorful debate on which power controls what. Really, there are so many options I could go on. This is what I could predict though, and it all centers around Wilson and Russia. Roosevelt was against Wilson going to the treaty conference in Paris.
Wait, let me go back for a second there.
Power controls what? Really, there are so many options I could go on. This is what I could predict though, and it all centers around Wilson and Russia.
I thought so. And I'm not going to criticize this too much because I've done the same thing in my own videos. We're missing a letter there. Ideological. Anyway, not a big deal.
Roosevelt was against Wilson going to the treaty conference in Paris because he believed that Britain, who fought more, should have had more of a say.
And remember, historically, Roosevelt loses a son in this war. His son, Quentin, was a fighter pilot and was shot down behind enemy lines. So, he had some skin in this game. He definitely had some opinions on this war because he lost a child. And Quentin today is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery. I think he's the only World War I casualty buried in the World War II cemetery in Normandy because they exhumed him to bury him next to his brother, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who landed with the first wave at Normandy on the beach and died of a heart attack soon after taking command of a division there.
That opinion easily could have changed if the US fought only 1 year less than Britain, so perhaps he still goes, or at least as a diplomat with his ideals in place. The main thing that changes in this timeline isn't the inclusion of Roosevelt, but the absence of Wilson. Wilson pretty much used the treaty conference as a way to promote his own worldview, the most infamous of which was, well, the League of Nations. Austria-Hungary still would collapse, and new nation-states take its place just like in our timeline.
Yeah, Austria-Hungary, I think their collapse is probably inevitable, as is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Germany, less so. Austria-Hungary has all of these different factions. They're a dual monarchy with Austria and Hungary, but they've also got other states, and they've got a lot of groups of ethnic groups and languages and religions going at play here. They're much less of a kind of a united empire than Germany is.
But for the victors, they would not lose their territory. Russia going forward still remains relatively backwards compared to the West, but it would never see the mass collectivization and famine like under Lenin and Stalin. Oh, which brings me to... the collapse of the Tsar and the failure of the war was the perfect storm to allow such an extremist and violent section of Marxism to take over. The Bolsheviks were the farthest of extremists.
Yep.
They didn't just go after the former autocrats of Russia, but the Mensheviks, less extreme communists, and socialists as well. That iconoclastic, autocratic, and brutal zeal that became the defining mark of communism was birthed from Lenin and his war against anyone he perceived as an enemy of the revolution. Without Lenin, the entire fate of socialism in the West entirely changes, along with the enemy that basically fueled Wilsonianism into the modern day.
And remember that most of what comes after World War II is a result of stuff that happens in World War I. Everything's connected, like we always say. And communism versus capitalism defines the second half of the 20th century.
Bolsheviks, there is no great enemy. The rise of communism was such a series of specific steps, I doubt it would be replicated into the 20th century without Russia.
Here's a question. Do we land on the moon in our timeline without a Soviet Union? Because there's no space race. There's no great superpower for the U.S. to compete against. Is the U.S. even a superpower without World War I and World War II going the way it did historically?
It really was only because of the desperately poor environment in that country that led it to be. That brand of communism simply doesn't arise, left to the history books like anarchism.
Oh, snap.
So both sides, capitalistic and socialist, are less extreme in this alternate 20th century. There is no great war between ideologies, which is what Lenin and Wilson ended up perpetuating in their states. Which is where things actually start getting weird, because a lot of policies were shot down in the West once communism rose, because people rightfully feared it'd lead to a Lenin rising in their country.
That's true.
Which is where I'm going to take a detour.
And listen, anytime we talk about alternate history, there are going to be differing views and differing ways that people see things. I've had a lot of debate with some of you in the last couple of days in our differing opinions on what would have happened and what might have happened. And that's great. And there's no right or wrong answers here. These are all just opinions based on what we think could happen. It's a fun kind of academic exercise to go through, but nobody's right or wrong, so I enjoy it, and I hope you continue to tell me where you think I'm wrong and where you see things differently.
As with anything hypothetical, predictions aren't 100%, just possibilities and an alternate path. And in politics, just because a party or politician wishes to do something doesn't mean they could always do it. Opposition always exists, and those outcomes can't simply be predicted. However, if Teddy stayed in office to see the US win the war, this would have been a massive win for the Republican. They'd have political clout, and potentially could have enacted some new legislation.
And remember, the Republicans have controlled the White House for the better part of 60 years at this point, with just the lone exception of the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland.
Teddy, in his first 2 terms, had busted monopolies and created national parks. But he wasn't just satisfied with that. And in the 1912 election, he laid out his goals. A complete overhaul of lobbying in Washington, a registration for lobbyists, and limits on campaign contributions, social insurance for the elderly, a nationalized health service, federal income tax, and an 8-hour workday. The most interesting idea for me is recall elections for those in office and judicial. Say the court makes a decision that the citizens disagree with. It can be overridden by popular vote.
Now, and that can happen in some states now. I mean, we know famously California has recall elections for governor. They've had a couple of them now. Here in Ohio, we can have popular vote to override the legislature by putting a constitutional amendment, for example, on the ballot to override things that the legislature does that the popular vote may disagree with.
Ten he was in office, it's likely the war would have taken up a majority of his third term.
The died in 1919 thing is something that's a point of contention for a lot of people. Remember, he's pretty young. He's like 60, 61 years old when he dies. He went on an Amazon trip after not being elected president again, something he wouldn't have done if he had been president. And there's some talk that some things that happened on that trip may have contributed to his early demise. So a lot of people argue he wouldn't have died in 1919 if he had been president.
But considering how hands-offish he wanted to be in the peace conference, unlike Wilson, I think he, or at least some in Congress, could have gotten a few of these concepts into legislation 100 years ago. In the words of Emperor Tiger Star,
"He did it with sanitation, he can do it again."
So since we got that out of the way, I decided this last part will be... The fate of Germany in a quicker war is entirely up in the air. However, I think there's one pretty simple answer. Hitler doesn't rise. Now, why do I say that? Hitler's rise to power was not simply him walking into a defeated Germany and saying, he is Führer now. It was just like World War I or Wilson's election, only the result of a string of unique and bad occurrences. The fear of the Bolsheviks was a very real reality for post-war Germany.
Yeah, in fact, in the aftermath of World War I, you have a very strong push toward communism taking hold in Germany, and it very nearly did. And a lot of the rise of the National Socialists was in answer to the pushback against communists. You don't have communists, you don't have people flocking to the banner of the National Socialists.
In the 20s and 30s, the Soviets were neighbors to Europe. There had been brief yet failed communist revolutions in 1919 in Berlin and Munich, and just like during the Cold War, in fear of the Reds destroying everything was something in the public conscience. Maybe because that's what the Soviets kept saying they were going to do. While Hitler, yes, rode in on the public fear of the Jews, this also was hand in hand with the fear of the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, I've talked about this before. Jewish people were not the only ones that the man hated and wanted to be rid of. Bolsheviks were right up there. He hated the Bolsheviks, as he called them, every bit as much. And he would have gladly put them in camps the same way, and he did in a lot of cases.
But if the war ended in a crushing German defeat, and before the Bolsheviks ever could take control of Russia, those steps that allowed the Nazis to come in power in 1933 become an impossible uphill slope. There simply is no great enemy to fear.
Yep.
And I doubt such a thing as the Reichstag fire would ever have occurred. I really doubt World War II, at least the European war we all know, would have ever occurred. Many wars probably still might happen. Italy, the Balkans are still a thing. But I doubt the Nazis ever rise to power. What else that wasn't Germany? Oh yeah, the federal government would have remained desegregated. Wilson did that. In fact, the history of civil rights in America might have also went down a different path. Wilson is a complex figure in history. He was a man of startling contradictions. Wilson envisioned liberty as only spreading from a strong central government, or at least a strong central leader himself. Only him, an intellect and orator, could champion democracy through U.S. foreign policy. But in reality, it was just advancing U.S. interests under another name. Wilson either purposely or unintentionally misunderstood the world he wanted to change, and create a mindset which didn't reflect that world, or at worst, didn't care to. Even outside Europe, Wilson used his ideology to send the U.S. into Latin America to protect their interests. And it was really because of this that set a precedent in an age where such practices were becoming less acceptable to an isolationist public.
And you can see the echoes of that doctrine, Wilsonianism, throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st century.
The Wilsonian Ideal is the one that still dominates the United States. Fighting for democracy in actual true circumstances is a noble one, but ever since its inception, we have to understand it's also been a double-edged sword, one that can be corrupted into serving ulterior motives under the costume of liberty. It's a reason US foreign policy post-World War II has seemed so contradictory. It ended up overthrowing governments in Latin America and the Middle East. Teddy's old speak softly and carry a big stick style of imperialism was unique. It wasn't colonialism. The US was sick of that after the Philippines. It was more of get in, get out. Wilsonianism was about transforming the country that the US invaded. Wilsonianism did...
They call that nation building, is a term you often hear today about that.
Replace this old imperialism, but also modified it enough for imperialism to evolve and survive in the next stage of global empire, the battle over ideologies, the Cold War, or now, the battle between West and East. You know how they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, our road to hell was paved by mixed intentions. Wilson transformed foreign policy into a holier-than-thou, protector of civilization approach, even when... nah, it wasn't. But guess which one stuck around the longest? Now you may say, Cody, this was 100 years ago. Surely you can't put the blame on the rise of communism, Nazism, foreign endless wars, and the Cold War all on one man's presidency.
Not all on one man, I wouldn't say, but certainly one man contributed a lot to that.
Can you? Yes.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Some more original content coming your way. The next episode of the Gettysburg series will be next week. Should be probably by tomorrow. I should have my next top 10 for the end of the year for you guys. I've got a couple of those in mind. You're going to be seeing a top 10 list of my top 10 favorite Sabaton reactions of the last year. You're going to see my top 10 favorite historical YouTube channels of the past year. Those will be coming. And if you have other ideas for top 10 lists that I could do as we go into 2022, let me know. As always, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Check and make sure you still subscribe. Sometimes people tell me that they are no longer subscribed or that they're no longer set up for notifications. So check and make sure your notifications are on as well so you never miss another video. Thanks for watching.